Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, Politics Plus Media 101 family, wherever you are around the world. Today we have a special treat. Mr. John Gunnison and I are going to be talking about Tuesday's very much awaited and only debate in the Senate between Dr. Oz and Mr. John Fetterman.
Well, Justin, before we get to serious stuff, I'm going to have to pick your brain a little bit about the World Series. It's starting on Friday. That's when we plan to release this episode. So it's very timely. And not all of our listeners might know that you are yourself a bit of a baseball expert. And if I may say so, a former baseball phenom. In fact, someone who got a college baseball scholarship. So, we have the opportunity to speak to a very informed pundit about the upcoming World Series, and we can't take that for granted. We have to take advantage. So, Justin, we've got the Houston Astros against the Philadelphia Phillies, and we need to know, what should we expect? Who's going to win?
So first off, John, you've been getting a little bit back into baseball, which just warms my heart because I'm a fanatic.
Yeah, I used to watch every Red Sox or Yankees game on television. There were some years back around 1999, 2000, where I was watching like 100 baseball games start to finish on television. And when I moved to the Middle East, I kind of stopped. Now that I'm back here, I've gone to a few games this season in the Red Sox in Boston, the Phillies in Philadelphia, and I'm kind of enjoying getting back into the spirit of it again.
It's a sport for a more refined palate. Not everybody has great taste.
Compared to what?
Compared to everything else.
Compared to the Premier League and all
everything
that?
else.
It can get a bit rowdy, but
No, I just say that because I was a baseball player, so I'm a baseball fan first and foremost. I also have been getting more into it lately. I took a little bit of a break, but I wanted to start off by saying the playoffs this year and the new format they have has been absolutely captivating. Ratings are up. The stadiums are just electric. It almost feels like you're watching from a European football stadium. I went to the game in Houston on this past Wednesday, not this Wednesday, but the Wednesday before. And the atmosphere was just lovely. The hatred for the Yankees was palpable. You could really taste it in the air. But to quickly get into what we had the Houston Astros sweep the Yankees. So two behemoths, two juggernauts, two teams that were favored to get pretty far along, made it that far. And then Houston came out because, John, they have more depth in their starting pitching rotation. They probably have the best bullpen in baseball, which for playoff baseball, every single pitch, every single run matters. I know that that's a little bit trite and cliche, but this is the truth of the matter. One run can ultimately be enough to win the whole game. So when you have a good bullpen, that means there's less pressure on your starter, less pressure on your hitters, and you can just roll out the bullpen for 5, 6, 7, 8, ninth inning to shut people down. And that's what Houston has. So they were able to advance. And then on the National League side, the favorites were the Mets from New York, the Dodgers from LA, and the Braves from Atlanta. And all three of them bowed out rather quickly and rather easily. And we were wound up with the two wildcard teams, the second and third wildcard team, the Phillies, and also the San Diego Padres. Just for everybody, the Padres made a bunch of moves at the trade deadline to become one of the best teams in baseball. So they really did retool their team in August. The season goes from April through September. But the Padres, those kids up in Philly, John, they just started hitting home runs. And I'm pretty sure you saw some of those games where they were just batting the ball out of the park.
Well, I did. I was at a game where Nick Castellanos hit a home run and I saw the bell ringing. It was good fun.
So you went to a game in Philly?
I went to a game in Philly. I also went to a game in Boston this year. Justin is bashing the New York Yankees here. I think that many of the listeners know that I'm in Boston. You might be surprised to know I'm actually not a Red Sox fan. I'm a Yankees fan. My family are from New York, and my dad is from the Bronx. And his grandfather was an architect who helped, work on the old Yankee Stadium. So I've got a family connection to the Yankees, and I've always been a Yankees fan. And listening to this Yankees hate, it hurts me a little bit, but not too much. The old stadium's gone, so I'm a little bit less connected than I once was to the team. But yeah, I did go to a Red Sox game as well. And I have mixed feelings because I support most of the other New England teams, especially the Celtics. And
they're off to a heck of a start.
I'm kind of a Boston man now, but I'm going there. I feel a little bit ambivalent about the Red Sox, but I went to one of those games too.
You need to stay true to your roots. So if that's a Yankees fan,
Yeah,
you need to
yeah.
stay true to your roots, and that's for everybody listening as well.
I'm sticking with the Yankees. Yeah.
So the World Series, it's the Phillies versus the Astros. So the Phillies ended up beating the Padres, who have a great team. In my opinion, I thought the Padres were going to win the World Series. You had a lot of Mets and Braves and Dodgers fans complaining about the way that Major League Baseball does their playoffs. The Phillies were the better team, folks, top to bottom. And then they just ran into a buzzsaw. The Phillies, so in baseball, you think of a large crowd and momentum really impacting American football, where the noise can impact the state of play, whether the offense can hear the signals and then you're hitting people. So it's very physical and you get adrenaline from the noise, and that can really impact the game. But baseball, I would argue it impacts it more so because it's the most mental game in American, probably any sport out there, with golf. Because every single pitch, it's really a battle between letting your body do what it needs to do and what you've really fine-tuned it to do over hundreds of thousands of repetitions versus your mind getting in the way. So when the crowd gets involved as a hitter, you can either tense up and become more reluctant, or you can feed off of the adrenaline and channel it in a positive way, same way as a pitcher. So that is a long way of saying the folks in Philadelphia are absolutely insane. The ballpark is loud, and their hitters are just gamers. They are there to play. They love it. They rise to the moment. So they hit a bunch of home runs and they moved on. We have a very, very, very exciting World Series coming up because the best team is unquestionably the Astros, but the hottest team is unquestionably the Phillies. So what's going to happen? I have no idea. I'm going to say I'm jumping on the Philly bandwagon. I'm rooting for the East Coast team because, I'm a Boston boy living in DC now. Us East Coasters have to stay together against those bad Texans down there. So that's my team, despite the Astros being much better. John, who are you rooting for?
I'm going for the Phillies. I told you I was there in Philadelphia watching a game. I have a connection to Philadelphia that I don't need to explain on the show, but I was in Philadelphia for kind of personal reasons and enjoying the team, and I'm looking forward to rooting for them this weekend. I also understand that the Astros are a bit of a villain in the Major League Baseball. They've had cheating scandals, and I remember the stadium used to be called Enron Field, which is also kind of humorous.
They are the villain.
Yeah, the country will be rooting against the Astros, right?
Yes, they will. And I went down to Houston and I was rooting for the Astros, which made me sick. But I was only rooting for the Astros because it was against the Yankees. So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And that is true in political philosophy as it is in sports. But I now have to root for the Phillies because the Astros are the best team. They've been the best team for a few years now, whether they win it all the time or not. But all that I can say is, folks, you can tell by the passion that John and I are speaking about this topic. Baseball is back. Baseball is fun. And we have a week ahead of us of just great games and festivities. So I'm super excited. And I think it leads us into a pretty good topic, which is the Pennsylvania debate last night, Mr. Gunnison.
Yeah, I was going to say it actually is a pretty natural segue because we're talking about Philadelphia and the Phillies. And Justin has been wanting to talk about the Philadelphia Senate race. We talked about it a little bit on our most recent episode, but on the night that episode was released, there was the debate between John Fetterman, the Democratic nominee, and Mehmet Oz, who's the Republican nominee. Neither are an incumbent. They're running for an open seat that's being vacated by Pat Toomey, a Republican. So the stakes are pretty high. Fetterman had been seen as the favorite for most of this election cycle, but it's really been narrowing. And you could argue it's the most watched race in the country. You might say the Georgia one, but I think this one is up there.
I think you're right, Mr. Gunnison. Yeah, not only because it's very important, but you have a TV star in Dr. Oz who's running.
Yeah.
Just to put some numbers behind what you were saying, in 538's poll aggregator, last episode we cited Real Clear Politics, folks. Go to these websites. These are where you can get the information from the horse's mouth. In September 13th, the poll of polls. So that is just an aggregation of polls. And I think they weighted a special way at 538 for if they believe the poll is more credible, they give it more heft. And if it's less credible, they underweight it. John Fetterman had a 10.7 point advantage. That is huge.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
That's a touchdown and a field goal. So that's a lot of points. And then on October 26th, now, folks, the debate was last night. So these polls do not take into account the debate. it was just down to 2.3%. That is a huge shift in a month and a half. So that is the state of the race, like John was saying. The momentum was behind Dr. Oz. It was narrowing. Normally, debates don't matter. In my humble opinion, usually, if somebody wins or loses, it's within the margins, like maybe 60%, 40% view the person as winning and losing. It's not going to change your view if you're decided. If you're undecided, it's unlikely it's going to be the one thing that sways you. Debates only matter when they matter. And that is to say, debates only matter when somebody does really, really, really bad. And folks, that's what we had last night. It was an absolute train wreck. So this was going to be the only debate. And to be clear, Mr. Fetterman had suffered a stroke, I believe, in May. The expectations were really low. You had Mr. Fetterman using closed captioning to read the responses because he's been having some auditory issues where he's struggling to comprehend things as neatly and quickly as he was able to before the stroke. So there was that special setup, which was announced to the crowd. So you had a bar that was very low. Mr. Fetterman started off by saying, I'm going to stumble and mix up my words. So folks, please bear with me. And that's understandable. However, the way that this debate started, he could not get out his words and he was putting the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. It was coming out very ham-fisted. It was giving me anxiety watching it because it felt as if I understand he's dealing with a medical condition. And that's important, right? We're not making light of that. This is something that the voters need to know about and the reporter should focus on. But Mr. Gunnison, I was watching and it felt like I was watching somebody who was struggling because of anxiety. And specifically the first two answers were all over the place. And I was unable to, as a listener, follow on the content. I was focused on the delivery, which was not a good thing in this situation for Mr. Fetterman. And then he began to get better as the night goes on. So I wanted to start there.
I've got a couple things to say about this. On the most recent episode that we released, I raised the health issue as being relevant. And I think that it is. And I know that it's a very sensitive issue and people have very strong opinions about whether it's an appropriate thing to talk about in a political election. But, I expressed on the recent episode some of the reasons that I thought that it was worth thinking about. And we separate Fetterman, the person, from Fetterman, the candidate, when we talk about health issues like this. Of course, all of our sympathy is with anyone who's suffering from a serious ailment. At the same time, we're in a position as voters, not us in Pennsylvania, but us as American citizens, to evaluate the candidates for important political office on their ability to do the job. And I think that a sentiment that I've been seeing in a lot of the reaction to this situation is that a senator is a straightforward job. You show up and you vote yes or no. And the most important thing is to have someone who can just vote the right way. And I think that we should talk about this because I think there are misperceptions about what a senator needs to do, even in the day-to-day operation of their office. And, I did Capitol Hill internship. Justin, you worked on Capitol Hill for years. So you're in a good position to kind of explain what are the other things that a senator needs to do other than just vote and why it's important to have someone who's in a position to do it really capably.
Well, and I'm now, folks, unfortunately 34, because I just had a birthday somewhat recently. But I do want to say my absolute best friend from childhood had a series of strokes not too far off from when John Fetterman did. So I'm not making light of this. It's a serious issue. But like John was saying, we're not dissecting the health life of my friend. We're dissecting the health life of the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania and a potentially future senator.
Well, we're not dissecting his health life, but what we're doing is we're considering what's publicly known about his health condition as we're evaluating his ability to execute the responsibilities of a United States Senator.
Yes, we're talking about his health life in the context of whether or not he's able to be a senator. And I would start out by saying, just really quickly, not to get into the ins and outs, having worked a couple of years on Capitol Hill and then lobbying and, adjacent to all of this stuff. First and foremost, not even voting. being a senator is not a member of a team, not a member of Republican or Democrat. Being a senator, first and foremost, is fighting for your voters and fighting for what you believe is the best vision of the country moving forward. So what does that mean? That means having somebody, when these large pieces of legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill are being debated. And I hate to use an example. We can use Bernie Sanders as an example, or we can use Joe Manchin. Both, for example, during the bipartisan infrastructure bill, they were in a group of 10 and they were fighting their damnedest. They were advocating, they were bridge building, they were bridge blowing up. But ultimately, what they were doing from their perspective is they were advocating for policies that advanced the lives of Vermonters, West Virginians to the best of their ability, and then Americans, second to those states, even if they believe those policies are best for everybody. So at the end of the day, you need to have the mental ability not to understand whether you should vote yes or no on a bill because it's with or against your party or the other party, but you need to have the ability to sit down, understand what your staff is telling you, read key parts of pieces of legislation, and then go out and coalition build so that you can then advocate for what is in the best interest of your voters. That is primarily the first and really last thing that a senator does. And that is takes a lot of adroit maneuvering. It takes personability, and it takes mental acumen, John. So that is to say, it's not just voting yes or no.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that the job of the senator is just about voting, it's voting on what, right? I mean, you're voting on a bill, and there's a process of creating a bill that involves a lot of negotiation. And that's important. That's a really important part of the job. That's what you just expressed. There's also everything else that the office is responsible for, like, for example, constituent casework. That was something that when I was doing these kinds of summer internships and you were doing in a professional capacity, it was a big focus of the office. And the senator himself or herself is not necessarily going to be the one, filling out forms and being on the phone with constituents who, veterans or others that need help on cases. But the senator sets the tone for the office. The senator is responsible for the functioning of the entire office. They have to hire staff. They have to set the standard, from top to bottom. Anyone who's worked in any kind of organization knows how important organizational culture is and to the functioning efficiency of any organization. So you need the principal to, start the responsibility that flows downward. You want to have someone in that position who's really capable of doing the job, because, we build up these public figures as characters, personalities, almost like they're on a television show and we're rooting for one or the other. But the stakeholders are all of the people of that state. It's not an audience. It's real people who have their lives and livelihood and wellness at stake, their economic situation, their own health, and so on. And so you've got millions of people in this state that are relying on one person and his office to do this work. So, if you think about him as the important character that you're rooting for, think about every single constituent as being an equally important character in this story. And we have to keep that in mind, because the stakes aren't just, entertainment and personality. It's also all these other important things. And it's not just about showing up and voting yes or no.
Yes. And everything you said is accurate. And there are two things that I want to say which are intertwined here. Number one, we're not unfairly singling out Mr. Fetterman. There has been an epidemic in the media for years, ever since I got into politics, graduating in school in 2013 and getting into politics, of underreporting, of protecting even elected officials that are not capable of doing the job. Thad Cochran potentially, I'm going to choose my words very carefully here. Thad Cochran potentially had Alzheimer's or a very significant cognitive debilitating disease. And he, folks, was a chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee, which is the committee that controls all of the funding. So when I was with Puerto Rico, the governor during Hurricane Maria, we were negotiating with his staff, and his staff, unelected, were the ones deciding hundreds of billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, whether or not it would go to these people in great need in a hurricane. And that's simply unacceptable. And that's a Republican that the media was protecting. We have Chuck Grassley right now running an election who the media is protecting. There are questions there. Dianne Feinstein on the Democratic side, she's in office. And there are other folks. We don't need to list every single one. And I'll leave the member that John wants to reference for him to get into later. But also, Mark Kirk is probably the biggest analogy.
Yeah, I mentioned Kirk when we were on the other program earlier this week because Mark Kirk also had a stroke. So it's a quite comparable situation.
And reporters protected
what's happening
right
with Fetterman. Yeah, I mean, it did eventually certainly make its way into the press and into the public consciousness that Kirk's ability to do the job was limited by his condition. And this was partly exposed, I should say, or it became very apparent during a debate, an exchange that he had with Tammy Duckworth, who was challenging him for the position. He made a very strange, confused comment to her that came off as racist or insensitive. And it seemed as though, by the way he was speaking and the way that he was thinking, that this might have been influenced by his situation. What Justin said about the staff and all of the power that staff have in a position, in a situation when the senator is not fully responsible, think about the scrutiny, checks and balances, accountability that are on staff and compare it to a senator in the correct situation. I mean, the staff member, you don't know their name. We don't have public accounting of any conflicts of interest that they might have. We don't know very much about their connection to the state in a lot of cases. The media are not scrutinizing and analyzing them any way close to the same level as what a senator might get. The voters are not even familiar with who this person is. It's an anti-democratic situation when you've got the staff making all the decisions that the senator is supposed to be making.
Slight correction. The senior staff does have to fill out financial forms for conflicts of interest.
I'm not just talking about the documentation, though. I'm talking about the level of media scrutiny on potential conflicts of interest. We've seen how senators who have a high level of disclosure requirements are exposed only through media investigation to have serious conflicts, right? Look at all these insider trading scandals that have occurred just in the last
Richard
Congress.
Burr comes to mind, yeah.
Yeah, Richard Burr, Kelly Loeffler, there's others.
There was a Democrat, too, I can't remember.
The safeguards that the House ethics or the Senate ethics have in place are not strong enough. We've seen how Nancy Pelosi is dragging her feet on banning individual stock trades by members. And the level of financial tie-ups that they have are often not really coming to light until the media notice them. Because even if they're being disclosed, they're just getting a nice big gold star from a lot of the those who are responsible for congressional ethics, right? The staff are not getting that kind of scrutiny almost ever.
And then just to add to that, John, imagine that your boss is clearly on the back nine of public service. You know that. You're in the most powerful committee position as a Senate staffer, and you know your time is limited, and you have all of these special appropriations bills, aka disaster relief bills, where there's tens or $100 billion that is going to be spent, and you could, get away with tucking a few $100 million in here or there for special interests that wind up hiring you without any type of accountability. That's the stuff that is scary.
Yeah, it's not just about being on the payroll already of some other group. There's revolving door, which you mentioned. There's also your personal network, your friends, the people you went to college with, the people who used to work in your office. There's lots of ways to have conflicts of interest, which aren't illegal, but still change policy outcomes. And we need to know about these so that we can understand what's going on with our public responsibility.
So I wanted to make 2 points on that. So back to the debate. And this is a real criticism of the media. So first off, some on the left of the paradigm here, when folks are bringing up, in my opinion, in John's opinion, very legitimate questions about the candidate's health, in this case, Mr. Fetterman, they are attacking people who have good faith questions and good faith criticisms as being ableist, as somehow that we are, in my case, we, the royal we, are attacking Fetterman because we have some prejudice against folks that are disabled. That is not true. This has nothing to do with folks that have had strokes that aren't running for political office. This only has to do with transparency, vetting, and the democratic process that every voter is due. So that's the first big issue here, is that there has been an air of silencing criticism and silencing investigative reporting on a candidate's health, which, in my opinion, is disgusting. And it puts our democratic system at risk, because if you start silencing legitimate questions about health, maybe you wind up with somebody who's mentally unstable as your president, right? That could easily happen. And you don't want that type of person to have control of the nuclear codes, for example. The second thing that I wanted to point out is there were liberal columnists. I'm thinking of Kara Swisher specifically, the podcast host, who, when I think it was an NBC reporter came out and said, I just had a discussion with John Fetterman. He was fine when there was closed captioning, which we described earlier, but he was not okay when discussing small talk with me without any closed captioning. When this reporter said that, and it was retweeted by Josh Kraushauer, who we had on this show, who's now with Axios, he was attacked from the left, from these reporters. And they basically all circled the wagons. They put on their partisan blue shirts, and they cascaded and attacked this reporter for making stuff up because John Fetterman was on their podcast and he was totally fine, which is bullshit, quite honestly. Obviously, there was small talk before the closed captioning. Obviously, there was something wrong, as evidenced by the debate, as evidenced by other reporters. There was a Time reporter coming out after the debate saying that he wasn't as bad as the debate, but he was clearly not healthy when they had a conversation. So that is to say that these columnists, which, folks, you need to be careful if you're taking from the right or the left any type of political news from folks that are on Team Republican or Team Democrat and have an agenda, you're probably going to get stuff that's filtered. And in this case, from these folks, it was untruthful. And it did the opposite, John. It actually rose the bar. It rose expectations for John Fetterman, the way that they were portraying him as being healthy and normal and sounding totally fine, in a way that set him up for greater failure. So although they were trying to circle the wagons, they ultimately hurt their candidate more so than ever. So I think that those two media critiques are very important, because we need to push back, no matter the size of the show or scope of discussion, to ultimately create a healthier media ecosystem.
Okay, so I've got a few things to say about this, and I think we might be thinking about this a little bit differently. So the first thing is, you mentioned the media or others protecting information about the health of a candidate, hiding it, shielding it from the public. I mean, when you mention that, the case that really comes to my mind is John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was the U.S. president and was suffering from Addison's disease, which was a debilitating illness, very, very serious illness. And he was on a cocktail of drugs in significant moments throughout his presidency, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you gave an example of someone, in a altered mental state, having their finger on the nuclear codes. I mean, there you have it. There couldn't be a starker example. And that we can look back at that and see how we avoided the worst, but also be astonished at how dangerous a situation that was for our country, right? The U.S. Senate, we talked about all the reasons it's important, all the responsibilities the Senate has, doesn't rise quite to that level. But again, health is relevant. We're stakeholders, we're constituents, and we need our representatives to be operating at the highest possible capacity. However, in this case, I'm not actually really sure that we have a huge problem of health information with the candidate being shielded, because the campaign actually did make him available for interviews, and they put him forward in the debate. And you talked about how, I think it was an NBC News reporter, interviewed him, interacted with him, and gave a pretty fair and honest accounting of that situation and what she observed, right? Now, you said that there were columnists that kind of pushed back on that and tried to spin it or depict it differently. And I think that's all that I might really expect. I'm not really that surprised. But I think that the reporter, the one who's really responsible for giving us news, it seems to me like she did an honest job in a difficult situation with a lot of sensitivity. The campaign, like I said, did put him forward in the debate, and we were able to witness him in a debate environment for the full length of the debate. So I think that, to the extent that we're concerned about how his health emergency was impacting his cognitive ability and all of that, we were able to kind of see without many filters. I also want to say that I really don't like this thing about expectations and the bar and where the bar is set and where expectations are set for the debates, because we get into the habit of grading candidates on a curve instead of evaluating them against each other. And we witnessed this a bit with the Herschel Walker. And a lot of what we've been saying about Fetterman applies to Walker, right? We're talking about witnessing someone who's maybe not at the top ability that we would expect of a senator. And we've certainly seen that with Walker as well. But when these candidates are going head to head in debate, the bar should be the performance of the other candidate, not just their rhetorical, theatrical performance, but also the substantive offering that they're making during the debate. That should be the bar. One candidate against another candidate. It shouldn't be about, well, we understand this candidate to be a bit softer, so we should give them a big handicap in how we evaluate their performance. I mean, we're just getting away from a really serious consideration of how the candidates line up against each other when we start doing that. And it's just a lot of spin, isn't it?
Well, John, debates are not real serious evaluations of how the candidates stack up. I think that first and foremost, the formats don't really allow for that. Second, the candidates don't really take it that seriously. So we disagree on this. John would call me more cynical. I think that ultimately, from the way that I'm looking at this, is perception matters. And ultimately, a debate really doesn't matter if it falls within the normal bounds of what folks were expecting to see from these candidates. So the bar, from my point of view, is really whether or not the performance is so egregious that it falls outside of what is expected. So I do think that this expectation setting really does matter.
So look, we're getting into this meta-analysis when we start looking at things this way. When instead of observing what we see, we start trying to project how we think others are seeing it according to our understanding of their perceptions and how they've set their expectations. I mean, we're getting further and further away from reality when we start doing that. And I think that that's how sometimes the media veer a little bit off course. Instead of looking at something straightforwardly, we separate from events level at a time. And instead of actually assessing and analyzing the event itself, we're so many degrees separated that we're evaluating something completely different. I mean, we've seen how in recent years, so many major media outlets don't even react to news anymore. They react to reactions to news. And that's sort of what we're doing here when we talk about how do we think people are perceiving this. Let's talk about how we perceive it.
I hear you, but if there had been a consistent message that, listen, this guy had a stroke, he can barely string two sentences together. This is going to be for transparency's sake. We're going to get him out there. He can do the job. It's just he's having difficulty talking and listening. That's one thing. When you have the whole left, columnists, the partisan media on the left saying, no, this guy is fine, a few of the bigger voices on the left, that resets the expectations of what we're going to hear. And it takes away an honest perception that many had if these folks consume media from these people that have millions of Twitter followers and millions of podcast listeners. So I do think it's important that they misled their listeners and put out some stuff that was not even remotely close to honest into the public discourse. And it John, it changed the way I perceived the debate going in. And ultimately, to recenter this on our thinking and feeling, the guy couldn't string together two sentences, the first two answers of the debate. He started off the debate by saying, "Good night, Pennsylvania." He literally could not string together two sentences. But even beyond that, John, he was asked a question about his opposition to fracking. So in 2018, he said, under no circumstances would I support fracking, and that he was completely against fracking. And then on the campaign trail, I believe in the primary, he flip-flopped. So he was asked about that in this debate. And I don't know if he was just outright lying or if this was due to his health condition. But because my expectations were that he'd be able to handle himself on the debate stage, I now have to assume he was outright lying. He answered the question about his opposition to fracking as saying he never was opposed to fracking. despite there being a very clear and consistent quote that he was, in fact, opposed to fracking at one time. And then he began to stumble and bumble and mumble his way through the answer. And it's probably going to be a debate ad. It's probably already up there as a campaign ad for Dr. Oz. But it really highlighted dishonesty from the candidate, which is absolutely verifiable. You can look up his previous quotes on this, where he was unequivocally against fracking, and now he's in favor of it. And also, it potentially highlighted his health issues. So, from my perspective, taking away the outside media, I thought his performance was horrible, so far out the mainstream of expectations from anybody that could watch a professional politician debate. And this guy is a professional politician. He's been a mayor since 2006, and that's been his job. I think that this will negatively impact him.
Yeah. So just, kind of wrap up your response to, my comment about expectation setting and setting the bar. And, you've criticized the way that some political columnists have approached that. I would give advice to the audience that's very straightforward. Do not go to political partisan columnists for any accurate evaluation of the medical and health condition of a candidate. Okay? Don't listen to political columnists who are telling you about a candidate's mental or physical health. Okay? Go to the news media or other reliable sources. All that you should be able to expect, we're talking about expectation setting, is that you're going to get a bit of spin from those sources. Okay, so getting back to the debate
Well, that's
itself.
the other thing. During the debate, he was asked, are you going to release your full medical records? And he had an opportunity to answer that. And just for the audience, in 2017, Fetterman's feet began to swell and he had to go to the hospital. He was diagnosed with atrial fibrillation. In 2019, Fetterman collapsed while presiding over the state Senate. He became wobbly and there was a health matter there. And then he had his stroke, which has clearly left visible and auditory issues that anybody can see. And he answered the question with no, I'm not going to release my medical records. So I can understand how folks would be frustrated and maybe a little bit confused about where they should get their health records when a candidate's not being transparent.
Well, I did see some reactions from observers saying the campaign shouldn't have let him debate. They shouldn't have let him debate. And I think that that's another sort of strange way to look at this, because you're advocating for less transparency. You're advocating for those responsible to conceal information about this candidate's health. Again, we're just getting into rooting interest. We're getting into meta narratives. We're getting further away from the actual substance of any of these events. And we should be glad about any transparency that we have into these situations, because we need to start looking at these things more and more as citizens than as those who are interested in the fights and the characters.
People can go to my Twitter feed, Justin Higgins, and look, I don't think they should have let him debate. And John, I understand what you're saying, but the message we're getting from the Democrats is that democracy is on the ballot. So if democracy is on the ballot, and if your job as a campaign person is to basically win at all costs within the bounds of what is legal, ethical and moral is a different question, but what is legal is what these campaigns are technically bound by. Then you need to put winning above all else. And the only reason why they didn't debate for transparency. They debated because they were starting to get so much criticism. They thought they had to debate no matter what. And they thought that rolling out the candidate there in his current state would be better if he could, somehow get through the night. And he couldn't. So former, I believe it was Pennsylvania Governor Ed Rendell, a Democrat, came out saying he shouldn't have debated. There's an NBC News story quoting 3 or 4 Democratic strategists basically saying the same thing. One Pennsylvania strategist went as far to say, as this race is over, Democrats should start pouring money into Ohio. So I truly believe if we're hearing that democracy is on the ballot, if we're truly concerned that the Republicans have an authoritarian streak, and if it's the job of the campaign to win and protect the candidate, I don't think he should have debated. I think everybody that allowed him to debate, that pushed him to debate, should be fired. I think that the Democrats potentially lost the Senate last night. I think that's how serious it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite understandable that Ed Rendell, who is a Democratic politician, would say that, because for him, he's looking at it from that perspective, the campaign perspective, winning perspective. But what I'm saying is that the voters should be glad that they were able to witness the candidate and that his current condition was not concealed from them. But we're talking about this so much, and we're not really talking at all about his opponent. Justin, you watched the whole debate, right?
I did. It was John. Here's another thing. It was only 55 minutes long. Come on.
What did you see from Oz, Mehmet Oz, his opponent, the Republican nominee?
So I focused on Dr. Fetterman's health so much. The first thing I noticed was, and this really pissed off conservatives, was the moderator wasn't calling him Dr. Oz. She was calling him Mr. Oz. So any response to that, John? That was a big thing on conservative Twitter.
Yeah, well, I understand why they would be concerned about using the name that he uses in his media career, right? Because he has a public persona. That's a bit of a character. And I think that the media have an interest in, trying to put him forward and position him as the real person that he is instead of the role he plays in a television show. We had this problem with Donald Trump where so many Americans literally voted for a fictional character. They didn't vote for Donald Trump, the person. They voted for Donald Trump as they had seen him on television.
The Apprentice.
Yeah, he played a character named Donald Trump on a television show called The Apprentice, and it was fiction. It was a fictional office. It was a fictional company. It didn't resemble his real office, his real company, his real personality, his real aptitude. And voters believed, because of the reality TV age that we live in, voters believed that the fictional character was a real person, and they voted for that character thinking that he was a real person. But Donald Trump, the person, is not Donald Trump on The Apprentice. And maybe it was with that in mind. And I hope I'm not contradicting my earlier point about trying to project onto the way voters are thinking. But I am trying to explain maybe a little bit why there's a reluctance to call him Dr. Oz in this context. And maybe it is appropriate to call him Mehmet Oz, the candidate.
Mr. Oz.
Dr. Oz, the person on television. Yeah.
No, you're not contradicting yourself. You're talking about how you perceive the way the moderator approached it. So that's actually consistent.
Yeah, I'm talking about what's a responsible thing for the media to do as they put forward a candidate who, because he plays a character on television, there might be some confusion about who he really is.
So let's get into the performance. And I've been making a big deal of Fetterman's verbal and just his physical performance during the debate. And I'm going to try and explain this from my perspective, but it's also going to be, what I think resonates with voters, because that's just how I also look at these things. So for me, John, I was struck off the bat without substance about the difference in the way they were able to talk, right? Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, was very fluid in his speech, which would make sense. He's been a TV star for years. He was very quick talking, which resonates with me, and then we juxtapose it with what Mr. Fetterman was doing, and it was glaring. It took me a while, just those differences. Take away all the texts I was getting from my liberal friends and conservative friends, both on the opposite spectrums of how they were seeing this thing. But it was like, it took me a while. I needed to grab the desk. And it took me a couple questions and okay, what are they actually saying? So from a substance point of view, things that I took out of it were Dr. Oz said that he would support President Trump if President Trump was the nominee. He said that he'd support whoever the GOP nominee was. So that was one thing. I think a big thing that the media took away from this was Dr. Oz said that abortion should be a choice between a woman, her physician, and local politicians, which is Is that a direct quote? It's pretty damn close. If it's not a direct quote, it's a very accurate paraphrase. I think it is a direct quote. It's gotten traction, right? And you've had Democratic pundits say, oh, he lost just because of that. Again, I think he won the debate unequivocally. But I think that was eye-opening because of, okay, it's a policy that I disagree with. It sounds ridiculous to me, and I assume it sounds ridiculous and offensive to a lot of voters out there that aren't pro-life across the board. But also it sounds callous, right? Because abortion is such a personal decision that probably folks that even go through with it, especially that go through with it, are, wringing their hands over. It's a traumatic experience. And this guy's saying, well, local elected officials need to be in the room and deciding it with you. And that just jumped out because also, this isn't the professional word, but he came off as smarmy. Like he came off as a smart aleck almost, where he was condescending to this guy who, I don't think he treated Fetterman bad, but his personality is a little bit like, John, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, like abrasive in a too slick by half kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, that's smarmy. I think smarmy is a fair word for that. What did you hear from Oz about some of the economic issues or the crime issue, which is another issue that's gotten a lot of focus in this election? Do you hear him propose any policy plans that he might pursue?
So for crime, he attacked Fetterman. And I'm not going to repeat sure, I'll repeat the attack. He mentioned an issue from Fetterman's past where he got in trouble. And then he also tied Fetterman to, I believe it was the non-cash bail movement. So he basically tried to say Fetterman's a past criminal who's letting these folks out, which is bullshit. He had no solutions on crime. It was just an opportunity where he took the question and pivoted to attack. I think the same was true about the economy. He took the issue and pivoted it to, well, look at what Fetterman loves Biden and look at what Biden's done. And he ticked off high gas, high food, high inflation, all of these things that he just blamed the Democrats for. So very lacking on substance.
Yeah, to get into a bit of this media criticism that we were doing throughout this program, I was watching a bit of CNN today and I saw John King, I think his show is called Inside Politics. I was watching his program and they were talking about the governor's debate in New York, the state of New York, between Kathy Hochul and Lee Zeldin. And King and the other panelists kept talking about the Republicans are focusing on crime. They're raising crime. They're making crime an issue. And, that makes them strong because it's an important issue and they're focusing on it. And I think this is kind of strange because there's a big difference between mentioning that something is an important issue and actually having a feasible, responsible, well thought out plan for how to address it. I mean, those are very, very different things. It shouldn't ever be considered good enough that someone just mentions an issue that's going on. I mean, I can say inflation, I can say crime a million times, but if some of what I'm offering is going to make those problems worse, or if I don't have any idea about how I'd want to address them for better or worse, I mean, it's not really much of anything, is it? I mean, you're just looking at polling numbers and looking at the things people say they care about and mentioning them. And it's funny to me, especially on the crime issue, a bit less on the inflation one, but although to some extent on that too, but especially on the crime issue, because many of the Republicans who are talking about crime by saying that it matters are those that support extremely liberalized gun laws that we know are a massive contributor and perhaps the most significant contributor to crime in the United States, especially violent crime. And it's so strange that we're giving so much credit to them for talking about crime when the only policy contribution they're making, the issue is making it so much worse. I don't really understand that. I mean, we're giving them all of this credit just because they're mentioning it. But if you look at what they have to offer, it's so negative. It makes the problem worse. If we're concerned about crime, we need to support more conservative gun laws, stricter gun laws. I mean, small c conservative gun laws, laws that will keep dangerous weapons away from civilians who are using them to harm people. And those that are the most strongly against taking these steps are the ones that some of our commentators are giving so much credit just for saying that crime exists.
I totally agree with you. And in a lot of cases, like the inflation, like the crime, there was just a pivot from Dr. Oz to attack. I think one of the biggest and one of Fetterman's best showings was foreign policy. And the question was for both candidates, what is the greatest threat to America from a foreign policy perspective? John Fetterman came out, said 3 times China, basically. He didn't say China, 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 but he went and explained, as best as he could, that China was the greatest threat and that we need to, approach this from a strong strategic standpoint. And then Dr. Oz, and this really juxtaposes the two because John Fetterman also, when asked about canceling student debt, said, yes, he supports the president. When asked about abortion, he walked back his previous claims that abortions up to 38 weeks are fine. Little wishy-washy, but he said he supports Roe. and you can take that for what it is, but he's giving you specific policy prescriptions. He flip-flopped on fracking, but he said he supports fracking. Dr. Oz came out, and the greatest threat, he said, foreign policy-wise to America, was America's not projecting strength around the world, which, I mean, he started with Iran, right? And the fact that there were words of a nuclear negotiation, but that was his answer, John. So I'd love to get your perspective on that.
For one thing, the Iran nuclear negotiation is at least on hold, if not permanently dead at the moment, for a number of different reasons.
I've heard it's dead from a few experts too.
The two major reasons being the massive uprising and protest movement in Iran. And the second is that Iran are actively militarily supporting Russia's aggression against Ukraine, including with people on the ground in Ukrainian territory. So the Iran thing is off, at least for now.
In Russia, there are reports today that Russia, from John Kirby, who should be the press secretary of the White House folks, that Russia is actually sending folks to Iran to train them in how to quell dissent.
Yeah. The other thing is to say that right now the United States is not projecting strength. I mean, that is just such a bizarre claim. And it really shows that the person who said it is living in a bit of a bubble, or at least spinning things beyond recognition for some political benefit in bad faith.
Lying.
Because this year the United States has reached a near apex of its global strength and power. The effort that the United States have helped lead and put together on the Ukraine issue has been remarkable, and have demonstrated that, as some people put it, a rounding error of the U.S. defense budget is enough to cripple the armed forces of one of our nearest peer competitors. Also, the way that the Biden administration have been approaching the China issue is so far beyond any recent precedent in its strength and scope. The complaint that some might have about it is that it's too strong, frankly, and that it's impeding and inhibiting some of the trade links that we were hoping for a long time to develop with that part of the world. But as you can see with the recent limits that they put on technology in the Chinese market, the United States are now taking steps of a level of strength that we really have not seen anytime previously. I saw some commentators refer to this as the biggest geopolitical flex for the United States since the end of the Cold War. The United States are certainly not projecting weakness in the world today, and I think that that's absolutely bizarre statement. It would be hard to find people anywhere outside of that bubble, and it's a domestic one, who would make that claim.
From a delivery standpoint, and what I think most Americans took from this debate was that one candidate was a lot smoother than the other with their delivery, and one candidate, frankly, is unhealthy. And I think that this debate severely wounded Fetterman. His campaign should be fired for letting him go on stage. And I think that it puts the race and them at a great disadvantage. I think that from a substance standpoint, and I've rattled off a few things, Dr. Oz stayed away from substance, John. It was really, honestly, largely devoid of substance, whereas Fetterman came out saying he's in favor of student loans, he's in favor of cancellation, he's in favor of legalizing marijuana. The Roe v. Wade should be the cutoff for abortion. China's the greatest foreign policy threat. He's pro-fracking. And there were multiple other policy issues that he specifically spoke to. So from a substance standpoint, whether you agree with the stances or not, one candidate offered stances that he allegedly stands for, and another candidate didn't even offer any stances. So from that perspective, you got to give the edge to Fetterman. It's just that it took me a while as a seasoned viewer of political debates to brace myself and come back to reality and try and listen to what they were saying, because the delivery was just so bizarre and out of whack.
Well, we spent a lot of time talking about a debate that you say is substanceless. And also, after everything that you said about Fetterman for the first hour of this conversation, I think that many of the listeners are going to be confused that you've said that.
If we're looking at this as an exercise that is completely contrived and that is TV and that is bullshit when senators are long-winded and the responses are kept to 30 or 60 seconds. Who can answer a question in 30 or 60 seconds? It's just the American debate tradition is stupid, and it does not help our voters understand who the candidates are. But based on the fact that these are the rules we play by, Fetterman got his ass kicked. Now, if we're looking at this from a policy perspective, which debates in the United States are not, they are a TV show set up to create confrontation where politicians just pivot to attack each other, usually gratuitously, like we saw from Dr. Oz. From a policy perspective, Fetterman offered more answers. It doesn't mean I agree with all his answers. I happen to agree with a lot of them. That's just the substance, my takeaway, John.
Well, yeah, I think, it's a bit of both. It's a combination of theater and a bit of policy discussion, isn't it? I already know that President Barack Obama, he believed that it was pure theater, and he always resented having to participate in the debates for that reason. But the debates are a chance to see the two candidates in the same context talking about some public issues.
Mr. Romney, the 1800s called and they want their foreign policy back.